Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you actually are. You're listening to Ben Vidgen on the Deadline Report, Fresh FM. We're going to be doing basically a three-part section on Convoy 2022. I thought it actually started today. I'm going to be basically my co-guest or co-anchor is going to be actually Ruby Vidgen, who's my niece, and I'm going to let her introduce her a little bit about herself, explaining who her whakapapa is and why her uncle's dragged her on here. So basically, the short version is because she believes things that are different than I believe, and I want to get some balance on this. Hi, Ruby. Lovely to have you on board.
Kia ora, I'm Ruby. As Ben just said, I whakapapa to Waitaha, Kaitahu, Kati Māmoe, sort of the South Island area.
The mainland.
Yeah, the mainland,
the important bit.
My background is at the moment, I'm a student studying at Massey. I'm doing creative media production with hopes to go into documentaries and investigative journalism, but sort of do it my way, which is good. But so that's just a little bit about me.
So you, in other words, plan to be a broadcast, no money, unlike your uncle, in terms of that's what happens when you do media your way.
Yeah, pretty much.
Don't go to the dark side, really. Stay in the light. Look, we're going to turn around, so let's just dive straight into it. I've come up to basically cover the protests and be there on the ground because I want to see the contrast between what the New Zealand national media is reporting and what's actually happening there. Mm-hmm. You've got your own perspective, which is completely removed from mine. You live here locally. You're very much involved through the university scene. So your take in terms of who do you see the protesters and who do you see being the protesters' leaders from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, I've grown up in sort of quite a sceptical, non-government trusting environment for the most part. So a lot of my family.
Gee, I wonder where you got that from.
Yeah, I wonder. It still baffles me. But yeah. So I would say that from my perspective, I've been watching since COVID's really hit, the way that my family and friends have reacted to it has been very sceptical from the very beginning. And I've been very sceptical of the way that it's played out in terms of mandates and vaccines as well. But I've also just been mindful of the way that certain Republican agendas have unfortunately found their way into these skepticisms.
So when you mean Republican agendas, do you mean that is that coming from the national media or from the people that are actually, the let's call them the COVID media? So you meaning the locals that are down there?
Well,
me with our tinfoil hats.
Yeah, well, I'm mostly meaning people who've gotten their information from Facebook for the most part. That's where I've seen a lot of people who. I've watched QAnon quite closely, actually.
So that's where you're talking about the Republicans that pushing the whole kind of counter stuff.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And just, which politicians are aligning themselves with QAnon. Happen to be quite a few Republican politicians. Like, for instance, there was General, what's his name? General Michael Flynn. He was the National Security Advisor for Trump. And he was recently at a convention about QAnon, and he was doing his sort of speech, and at the back of his...
Yeah, and we've seen things like, Kelvin Arps on Counterspin, and he's actually, his program's been aired on Stephen Brannon's network in the United States. He's very much tied up with that QAnon. We've seen American vessels come into Auckland that have been tied up with guys like Wayne Lufia, who's one of the donors to the Donald Trump. So, so
there's definitely people, but the thing that I mostly have been focusing on is the way that they deny it to media, but openly post about it on their own social platforms. For instance, with Michael Flynn, he posted himself doing the Q oath on his Instagram account, and then once he was interviewed about it, claimed to not have ever heard of QAnon before.
Well, that's like Winston Peters holding the picture up of the green frog and saying he didn't know what it meant.
Exactly. So it's that kind of thing, and that sort of since QAnon claims to be like a patriot grassroots thing.
So what do you make of that sort of media where you've got guys like, Counterspin with that sort of QAnon aspect of it, and then we've got Winston Peters who's making noises, and and I put that to you in the context of the year before it advertised that during the last election he brought in the guys that promoted the Brexit in England, the Tories, I think they're called Andy Gigmore, and they were all Cambridge Analytics and all that kind of... What do you take of that from the viewpoint of what's behind that sort of QAnon kind of component?
I'm honestly not sure about that aspect of it because I haven't been able to really see how it links to New Zealand,
Yeah.
because my personal experience with it is just from family members who, from the start of 2020, started telling me quite anti-Semitic, questionable things, you know, from my prior knowledge of colonisation and white supremacy. It sort of made me scratch my head a little bit, and, you know, I'm someone who always wants to, I don't want to, you know, throw out any kind of information until I really know about it, but it's been 2 years I've been investigating it now, and
And what about from the viewpoint of that context of, like, because I think you've got something there, is that, you know, the sort of really bit in my mind began with Belly TK, where it's like throwing out this sort of the script gets thrown out by the national media about these guys being white supremacists, and then you turn around and you look at someone like Belly TK or even Brian Tamaki, and you're going, it sort of feels like that yes, those components are there, that QAnon components are there, but it almost feels like the way that the media responds, that they're kind of reading off a sort of a bullet sheet themselves, and it's like somehow that New Zealand model doesn't quite fit for this made for USA model.
Yeah, well, the thing is, since New Zealand is so unique in its way that we've been set up as a system, it's so young, and we were built on lies like most places, but, you know, the treaty was just, you know, 30 years after the treaty was signed, Māori were forced into Pākehā schools where the only thing they taught them was how to speak English, you know, and that's not really, straight away, that doesn't really align with
it's
the
even
treaty,
like your nan used to point out to us when we were growing up that if, you know, in her era, that if you were caught speaking Māori on the playground, you know, you looked at being actually seriously caned, you know, it was like, it wasn't just that it was encouraged, it was like you would be actively punished if you actually expressed your, you know, your Māori cultural aspect.
Exactly, and from the very beginning, as you've even talked to me about before, there's always been, unfortunately, tangata whenua who have been maybe bribed or convinced to join the dark side, and so, you know, in New Zealand it's quite unique with, I think a lot of Pākehā think of white supremacy as being something that can only be upheld by white people, and that's not really the case, unfortunately, especially in New Zealand.
So what you're saying is you can have, and let's put the cards on the table, you're talking about you can actually literally have brown white supremacists.
Yeah, definitely.
So you're talking to maybe even like, let's paint a picture of it, let's be honest, but it's that kind of Christchurch thing where you used to see a lot of the things like the Harris Club guys, which were actually actively, you know, white power, but they were actually partnered often up with Maori women.
Yeah.
So you have this thing where it's like they were nationalistic, and really they were actually okay with the white Maori thing, but it was like anything outside of that.
Exactly, but it's because of the active effort from our government to sort of teach our whole society that we don't have racism in New Zealand. You know, we have apparently the best race relations in the world. You know?
We're all right here.
Yeah, exactly, but that's because everywhere else is far worse and very, very bad, like for Indigenous people.
But what about the flip side to that, which is, you know, looking at today, all the iwis have turned around and targeted the people at the protest. Isn't it equally true that you've got a component where there's many people at that protest, well, at least this is what I'm seeing, that would sympathise with things like, and to help here, and to help your honky hunkle's pronunciation, ihumatato?
Ihumātao.
Okay, so you have that concept of people at the marae that are basically hapu and whānau, and they feel like they are actually being cut out of the process from the iwi component. How do you feel to that kind of critique?
Because in the beginning I had an auntie who's not vaccinated, and we went out or not in the beginning, but just at the start of this year actually, we went out to Marahone. She wasn't allowed on her iwi land there, which she has shares in, and I was like really taken back by that because it sort of didn't make sense to me, but I had it explained to me by another quite well respected tangata whenua who told me that the thing with Māoritanga is that there's no individual privileges, you know, you have the privileges of the hapu, and as much as, you know, every individual deserves their own happiness, if it's the whole hapu, the whole group that has unanimously decided something and a few people disagree, you know, that's...
But what I'm talking about is you have people at the marae who are like that component of the hapa and the whānau, and they're looking at things like the constitutional advisory panel, just saying there's no concept of individual power. It's all about the wider body. But what people like Professor Jack Fowler and Miramar Broughton are saying is that it's not just a case of inclusiveness, but it's actually the exclusion or the omission from rights of hapu and whānau. So there is a feeling that what I'm seeing at the marae, people are feeling like they're literally being excluded from their own decision-making process.
Yeah, well, I mean that's what I said about how it's a unanimous thing, is that, you know, there's very few, you know, as I just said, there's very few things in Māoritanga that are about individual rights, you know, and so it is unfortunate, but you have to look at it from the perspective that most marae, most iwi, not most, but I've seen a fair chunk, especially in Wellington, the marae believe that the way that the mandates are playing out at the moment is the right way to do it, and that's just the way that they're
which is also absolutely quite fair. And I guess really what I'm really talking about I'm trying to, when I walk through the grounds, what I find is I'm very divided, because at one level you if you go looking for it, yes, you can find the pro Donald Trump camp. You can definitely find the QAnon deep down the rabbit hole aspect of it. Even things like the concept of, in Australia they use a device called an LAD, which is basically a sound-based weapon. It really does exist. And we have them available in New Zealand by a company called Tactical Solutions. But there actually hasn't been any evidence that they're deployed down there. And yet there's this huge rumour all around that's just run all around the camp that's convinced that these things are LADs, and you're sitting there going, look, I'm not sympathetic to all that governments don't use technology like that, but where's the proof,
Exactly, and that's the thing is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and, it would suck if all these claims were true, but because to me there's not really sufficient evidence, and to a lot of people there's not sufficient evidence, you can't also expect, for me as a Wellingtonian, from what I've seen, I've lost my job over this, to be honest. The place I was working,
everybody,
definitely, business is down 75%, and as much as I do really sympathise with people losing their jobs because of the mandates and things, there's a real disconnect on both sides of not really understanding how both sides have come to the conclusion.
And that's actually hit the nut, because again, I'm constantly flipping through the situation where I'm sitting there. I'm seeing 45-50% at least of the people on the parliamentary grounds, which doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening outside of that protest grounds, but on the protest grounds, they are traditional, Labour, Green voters, and I'm sitting there going, number one, how does this match up when I feel that at least that let's call it the protest media actually is this very much QAnon based and doesn't follow professional methodology, but then I'm equally torn by the fact that and also add to that it's not just that it's using bad methodology, but it's methodology which is very neoconservative, right wing, which gives me the heebie-jeebies, and we deal into dark arts such as racism and homophobia, which I feel like, well, hey, how can we be protesting the same thing? But then yet the contrast is looking at a national media that won't come within 1,000 metres, who are looking at that particular phenomena from way from a distance. They're saying things which are actually more often than not just simply true, but absolutely, categorically fake news. And so I'm finding myself going, well, who's the goody and the bad guy information-wise? Because as far as I can work out, both of you are.
And one thing that I'm mostly concerned about, because to be honest, at this point, I would like it if the mandates could be changed to, so that less people are affected by a poverty trap, but at the same time, from my perspective, what I've mostly been seeing is how American propaganda has come into New Zealand. And so, for one thing, QAnon, one of their recent troubles has been that in California they're wanting to teach critical race theory in schools. And on the first day of the protest, I was watching the live stream, and you could hear the speeches, and someone was talking about how
protests in New Zealand.
How New Zealand wanting to teach New Zealand history is the same agenda that America has with wanting to teach critical race theory. And to me, the only people who would have a problem with learning New Zealand history and critical race theory are people who are racist.
Members of the KKK.
Exactly. So it's it confuses me that I've seen tangata whenua not wanting history taught in New Zealand, because literally, why would you not want that? That's the whole reason that we're in this position.
But that's a game which I find quite strange, because being your uncle, I don't mind going down the rabbit hole, and I look at the protests and I go, we've got people that are basically the media, and inside the camps are dominated by very much a right wing. They don't want to talk about the issues of things like racism. Then they get into things like Freemasonry, which you think they would love to go down that rabbit hole, but they won't. And what I find is people like Calvin Alps, who's a Freemason, and who, from the viewpoint of he's an organisation that for 150 years actually ripped off massive amounts of Maoris, and Donald McLean, I was reading about him today. Weirdly enough, there seems to be certain areas in that QAnon which are like off limits, because once you peel the layer back, it's actually exposing the things which are like, no, actually,
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing, is that it's like, people, oh damn, I can't remember what I was going to say.
Well, while you're getting your thought, I'm just going to say, it's not that I'm necessarily having anything against Freemasonry and I really believe in it, but it's just, I look at this whole double standard that goes on, this, what they like to say, cognitive dissonance, which is where they're talking about one set of values, but suddenly when it applies to people that belong to their own organisations, like, oh yeah, but we'll give them a free pass.
Exactly. Well, I mean, the problem is that, bringing it back to New Zealand culture as well, is that it's part of our culture to tell people to stop, don't make everything about race, oh, it's racist for Māori to be getting reparations, and any kind of talk about race is just stupid, because we don't have racism in this country anymore, you know.
But that again, to me, goes back to, because if you peel it back to things like, Governor Gray and I think it was Prebbleton who came up with the national anthem. It was like, it was almost sort of thing when they turned around, they talked about the noble savage, where it's like, oh, the great, so it's all like, we're all one good happy family, but it's like, only if you come from a certain class, and up there, yes, minor things might have been okay, but once you got down to certain levels, like, there definitely fucking was racism.
Oh, definitely, and it's just, it's unfortunate that it's impacted on Māori, because, I mean, the same auntie that wasn't allowed on her land, she was also speaking to me about how she thinks this is the most amazing display of unity to see people flying Trump flags next to tangata whenua, and to me that's the most New Zealand culture thing of all, because the whole point of being a Nazi is that you oppose unity, and so just because you're standing next to tangata whenua and you're a Nazi, that's not unity, that's just a bad system.
But it does become a tricky situation, because on one level you've got things like the TPPA. There were plenty of people who probably even support Jacinda now that are still opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which we did have people from the right come along, and I'm in a situation where I'm going, I can't help that the thing that I actually share, okay, I'm different on these things, like, I mean, not, like you start calling people Jewish or any form of bigotry, I'm out of here, but yes, I am against the idea of uber capitalism.
Oh, of course.
So, in the same level, I look at the situation where I struggle myself, as I'm going, well, I'm not actually that particularly cool on that sort of, even the conservative Christian right kind of like but then I'm seeing them going, well, I actually am opposed to the idea of breaching a constitutional issues. I'm opposed to the idea of overreach of government and all these things, and I'm sort of going, how do I get through to people that I'm not actually supporting what these people's values are, or that section of the value?
Well, unfortunately, just because of the language that we've used against each other in the last few years, it's quite hard to sort of come back from that, because both sides, you have pro-vaxxers calling people who are sceptical of the vaccine stupid, brainwashed, idiots. But on the other side, you do have anti-vaxxers calling everyone else sheep, and saying that they're not smart enough to know the special thing that they all know.
Well, that's the thing, but that's what I literally see in the middle. Is I see all this QAnon bunch of people who somehow think that they're the illuminated ones, and somehow with the power of the almighty Uncle Google, they can figure out things like thousands of professional professors. And yet, I also, from my academic background, I see people turning around and claiming this expertise. It was like, oh, I've got a university degree. I'm going, yeah, but it's actually in political science. It's not actually in this particular subject. So I see a level of ignorance actually also on the people that sort of immediately jump on that. Oh, the professionals must be right.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, my field of expertise is definitely not medical. That's why I don't really talk about the actual vaccine that much. I'm more concerned with the effect that this is having on our relationships with each other. Because it is going to be the thing that, when this is all over, depending on whether you believe it ever will be over, like, what are we going to, what's Christmas dinner going to be like, with the things that we've said to each other after this, like...
But it's sort of, the same strange kind of going back to this original concept, like, in a way, having a protest where you actually are at a protest where there are, what I'm actually seeing to a certain degree is that I'm seeing components from conservative, Christian New Zealand that might have voted national previously, and they're actually being exposed to cultural ideas which they actually wouldn't have normally. So in some ways, it's actually doing a good job of actually chipping away from prejudice and bigotry, because they're starting to go, actually you're not that different from that, and they tempering their ideas so that they can get that, and vice versa.
Of course, well, but there's also the alternative of people being introduced to these really important ideas, but in the wrong context by the wrong people, and so it means that they're introduced to it, and there's a lot less hope for them to...
Well, it's like the whole thing about Jacinda Ardern and the communism thing. It's like, and I'm guilty. I'm the one that actually came up with it. I did a thing called Ardern in 7 minutes, which everyone now repeats back to me, and they always miss the valuable line. Yes, Jacinda Ardern was in the International Social Organisation, but they missed the bit where they say that organisation was actually outed as a CI front. So you go, well, wait a minute, like you're jumping on, you're picking a fact which suits your narrative, and you're not actually reading, even when the author tells you, well, actually, there's another line. They don't want to hear about that other line.
No, and that's the thing, is that, people don't understand that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, it's like...
The thing that I worry about, though, in that component is, however, also as I see this aspect of, and I'm really quite critical of the national media. They're very overly corporated based. They've attempted to show no attempt of actually using the same standards and values which they impose upon the QAnon crowd. And in some ways, I would say they're partially responsible because of the fact that they haven't followed their own standards. They've led people, they've alienated people who've then looked for something else, and this thing stepped into the void. But I look at these particular entities down there, and I get very frustrated because I don't feel that both sides of the story are actually being told.
Exactly,
and I am sympathetic towards the people down here.
I completely agree with that, but it's a lot of people. I personally don't really like Jacinda, that, but I think that there's just a little bit too much blame on the government creating the divide, and not really enough actual. Looking at the way that we are talking to each other about it.
You think about how this would have played out, because you raised a good point. If say, for example, we had during the protests Chris Luxon instead of Jacinda Ardern, I wonder how many of the people that are actually hating on the protesters now would actually be down there, and vice versa, how many people at the protests who, because we say 50% of them are Green National, let's not forget 50% of them are not, so I wonder how many of them would actually be at home during it, how much of this is actually a partisan issue, which is like...
But I don't know, from what I've seen from talking to, the average New Zealander that isn't extremely obsessed with politics, maybe unhealthily obsessed with politics, like but they don't even see them as being people who are politically aligned with anything, and it doesn't seem like it's not a cause that's necessarily against Jacinda, it is against the mandates, but I don't know if there would be that much difference whether or not it was Chris or Jacinda, because from my guess, my guesstimation would be that most people down there would also understand that it's two sides of the same coin.
I actually, that's the thing where I would say very much lean and support in, is I actually find that group down there, as a generalisation, they actually do consider everything. So they do, some of them talk, you don't necessarily have difficulty finding stories about reptilian shapeshifters and other interesting stuff, but they do consider all these sorts of pieces. And, I've talked to a number of people that are down there, and they're looking at me and they're going, well, okay, everyone's turning around and calling us right-wing, supremacists, but what about the fact that we've got, a government that's actually... no one's talking about, say, for example, Ukraine, where the Ukrainian government was supported by a neo-Nazi, the Azov battalion, which we've aligned ourselves with the whole US backing support line.
Of course, yeah, but
no one's looking at things like the TPA, how right-wing economic that is. No one's really looking at things like the World Economic Forum. And it's quite interesting, because when you turn around and you look at writers like John Pelcher and Counterpunch, who are very, what I would call, high intellectual left-wing, they're actually saying, are we in a situation with these organisations that are actually right-wing by definition, have conned the left into saying going along with something, and it's actually they're creating a baseline which is bringing back in a new corporate right wing.
Definitely. I mean, that's some of my just the problem that I have with this is that I've seen my family members who have previously. I pride myself on being someone who will consider all facts until I make a strong opinion on something, and so I think a lot of people have been in the same boat. And because of the what it's been met with on the other side, it's pushed them further and further to being like, no, this alternative opinion is the opinion.
So basically, what you're talking about is that lack of that lack of dialogue and that lack of actually providing, showing people that there's another component to the protests is actually creating radicalisation and more.
Definitely.
Yeah, okay, cool.
And people are looking at it as too much of a. Just national issue, and it is in the way that our government is rolling it out in a way that no other government has really done it, but it's a vaccine that everyone in the world, and there's too much sort of demonisation of just as if our government was the one to actually create this vaccine and come up with these ideas.
But I also think while there's now clear about the mandates, I think this is actually there's an amalgamation of long-running feelings which have gone back more. They've gone back even there's a lot of people there that would have opposed John Key, and there's a whole journey that's led to them. It's not just the vaccine, and sometimes I think that's the problem, is that
definitely.
the media wants to try and keep the story.
I would agree that. I mean, I know that it's not just about the vaccine, but for the people, a lot of people who are there because they're anti-mandate, they became anti-mandate because they didn't want to get vaccinated in the first
well, that's
place.
true.
And it isn't completely a vaccine issue, but this is sort of where that QAnon aspect
So your
comes
group
in.
sees it as a vaccine issue,
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't really see it as a vaccine issue, but it is a vaccine issue because the mandates are for the vaccine.
And what about the sort of weird triangle which I noticed, which is, and correct me if I'm not saying this correctly, but we've got protesters from the Shelby Bay, which is kind of like a Wellington Iyumato kind of style
Shelby
protest,
Bay,
that have actually jumped from that protest and are now actually at Parliament, while we've got protesters from the student scene that are actually now going to the Shelby Bay protests, but to fill in the gaps, but they won't go to the.
Well, I mean, they're different issues, though.
But it's the same sort of protest base. It's sort of quite weird in a way. I find it a bit funny, actually.
I don't know, as tangata whenua, I probably wouldn't see it as the same issue, because the thing with Shelly Bay is that
but just what I mean is, what I just found quite funny is that you've got protesters who are sort of, that's their politics, but they've also turned around and said, okay, well, and they're tangata whenua, and they've gone away from Shelly Bay, they've gone to Parliament, and in their place you've seen students coming down from the Wellington scene that are filling in.
No,
so
it's
like,
funny,
I'll tell you what, I've just got to go off that protest, if you can sit here.
It is quite funny, but it just shows like the diverse thought, and it's okay because, we both of them agree that Shelly Bay needs to be saved, so both of them understand that side of why the government is fucked, but...
So how hard is it? I mean, literally just to be able to get... I've been saying to Nikki, and my motivation is I want to see something counterbalance against the Kelvin Alps, because as long as there's no other alternative media down there or any other alternative viewpoints, those guys are having a field day collecting votes and actually just radicalising basically.
Yeah, exactly.
So how hard is it to actually get students down there, just actually go down themselves and talk to the people firsthand? Because I don't know.
I mean, my flat that I live in, we've all been. Well, I haven't been down, but they've all been down. And my flatmate actually donated a bunch of food to them. His whānau came down with a trailer full of food, and so I'm at a kind of a unique position as a student, because we're all students that have kind of banded together, because we're the only ones who our parents aren't paying for us to be here.
So you get your own little bro town in Newtown.
Exactly.
Exactly like
that. Exactly like that. But so I guess it's sort of hard for me to be able to see, but from I guess my more privileged friends, it is very hard to get them to just go down.
And that's the weird thing, isn't it? It's the wealthier they are, the more they put on this, I'm the left wing, and they're just a bunch of dirty, filthy.
And
and I find that quite bigoted, even racist.
Well, that's the thing, is that both sides are just they're just as bad as each other, because it's like if you're on the side of being pro-vaccine, most people my age will post on the there was this at one point, everyone was posting your vaccine pass is the gateway drug to festivals, and so everyone was sharing that, like, the vaccine is the gateway path to festivals, and I was kind of like, why are you posting this? Like, the government's putting all this money into advertisement. You don't need to be aligning yourself with that when you yourself don't actually know exactly what it's like.
But on that same basis, I mean, here's the reality, is that I've said, hey, how about we come along and do a show and you can turn around and present your viewpoint, and so I'm not just turning around and like doing an echo chamber. Could you actually see this actually happening, where they turn around and News Hub or the story, and they say, okay, let's actually get some of these guys down there and we'll bring up a panel on them and they can discuss some of the things. Do you think that the national media would ever be that fair and balanced to actually give the ordinary person who's not counter-spin, who's not somebody trying to get into politics, that chance to actually just be heard without them always going for the crazy cat lady?
Well, I think so. I mean, I have hope, but I mean, I've just been extraordinarily lucky to be like someone who I've kind of, it shocks me how often I do get called upon by media, to speak, considering like I don't necessarily have views that align with our current government, but I think it's different because of the COVID risk, and like...
And that has changed the game.
That has changed it, is that it's like, most people will say, just go down, just go see it for yourself, and then we hear this stories about how there's cases of COVID down there, and, a friend of mine who, her mum is immunocompromised, and she's very passionate about the vaccines, and she's very passionate about other really important human rights issues as well. But I was talking to her about potentially wanting to go down myself, and she told me, oh, just be really careful. And I think the other thing is that you can't go down there wearing a mask for the most part.
Yes and no, because what the guy I talked to is he's the liaisons officer, Joe, and I actually talked to him about that. I said, what is the chances of actually doing open days where they can actually bring people down and actually who are masked up and have a guy like that so that people can walk around? And he said that was a good idea, and he wanted to, whether he's actually he was just patting me on the back, I don't know, but the feeling was they weren't adverse to that kind of concept.
Definitely, but from what we've seen with the disconnect of how they've been struggling already to get the word out on certain issues. You've got people accusing each other down there of being undercover cops and calling each other up, wondering who's running what. It would be hard to get everyone on board with, don't harass these people wearing the masks.
I think you'd actually be surprised, and this is the thing where I kind of go back to is that. When I go down there, I'm wearing a media pass, and so yes, I've been confronted and had are you the mainstream media? And I generally turn around and say, either say, look, hey, I've cleared it with the administration tent, or yeah, I am, but so what? And people go like, you say, and I said, I'm not corporate media, but sort of like there's been one hardline person, and I turn around and said, oh well, here's this person on security, so It's what I'm basically saying is I don't think it's as scary. It's been overhyped to how scary, and it's not. There's people. The people that I'm wary of are the people that you've seen on the edge of the protests that are more you'd likely see. You'll see on Manor Street when the protest is gone because they had nothing to do with the protests anyway. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but you've just said it yourself. People down there, so it's going to be kind of different when people know you. And it's understandable.
That's a fair point, and that's why I asked to talk to you today, because it's like, I've made a point not to be based down there because I don't want to be surrounded constantly by 24/7 because I might get brainwashed and
in a cult. End up with a tinfoil hat. No, but
funny you should say that.
No, but
they fit really well.
They do. Well, good sculpt. You can sculpt it to your own.
I need
size.
it for my hair. If I did that, I'd get sunburn on top of my head. I think what we're going to do is we're going to literally wrap it up right now because we've actually gone over time today.
Okay.
That's awesome. Look, I'm going to do other shows during the year, so I'd love to have you on board just, for exactly this purpose.
Definitely.
And thank you very much for being on board.
Oh, thanks for having
me. This is
me.
the Deadline Report with Ruby Vidgen and Ben Vidgen on the best, greatest little community radio show in the world and possibly the universe.